As long-term viewers of my channel may know, I cover input latency on many titles and machines. Now, one of the questions I've been asked quite a few times is whether or not plugging your controller in using the wired connection, thereby reducing the latency, the time from when you press the button and something happens on screen. Now, the latest DS4 pad that ships with the Slim and the Pro does have the option to travel data down the USB feed into the console, or so we're told. Both Xbox One versions have always had this option. Now, the difference here is that the Xbox One doesn't use Bluetooth to connect to the machine. Even though the latest consoles do support Bluetooth for PC connection, they don't use it on the console, they still use a Wi-Fi connection. The PS4, on the other hand, does use Bluetooth, which is lower latency but doesn't have the distance, so therefore there is already a caveat there to say that there's a potential for the PS4 to have better connection just on that level alone. So we need to benchmark and baseline our tests, and we do that by using the operating system. Now, one caveat here is the fact that the PS4 operating system is actually quicker than the Xbox One, even though the latest update on the Xbox One has improved it substantially by removing the snap-in function and thus greatly enhancing your experience of browsing through the menus. It is still slightly slower. So to achieve our benchline, we go into the settings menu on both and we browse using the D-pad to make a digital connection, and we test it once with the USB connection on a few times and once with it connected via its wireless connection to see what we get. Pitting the DS4 pad old to the DS4 pad new, what do we see? Well, identical figures really, a high of 79 milliseconds, a low of 67, and an identical average of 75 milliseconds throughout the menu system. This is on both the DS4 and the standard old DS4 using Bluetooth and USB. Now, Bluetooth appears to be pretty much identical. It may fluctuate a little bit within margin of error, but there are a few occasions where it possibly loses out by 4 milliseconds, but that's well within margin of error. And that's pretty good, that's pretty quick. So jumping onto the Xbox One S here using the latest pad, we plug it in first using the USB connection, and the results are not as good, but we did already expect this due to the latency here from the machine itself, i.e. the operating system. We see a high of 121, a low of 108, and an average of 117 milliseconds. Disconnecting and moving over to the Wi-Fi, we see exactly the same connection speeds as we saw with the USB point, so this doesn't really improve it at all and matches what we saw on the PS4. For the eagle-eyed amongst you, yes, the PC section is there, but for now we're going to concentrate on the PS4 and Xbox One operating system tests. And we can see that the Xbox One S, unsurprisingly, is slower in the operating system. For those that love the numbers game, it's around 35% slower. But the caveat, like I say, is the operating system, which we already expected to be different, and also the polling rates of the USB ports on the machines themselves. Looking at these tests and overall tests that I've done, I'm surmising that the PS4 comes in around 4 to 8 milliseconds and the Xbox One comes in around 6 to 10 milliseconds. But obviously the games themselves are more important and will tell a different story. So, just like Marie Antoinette said, let them eat games. Or play cake. Anyway. Something like that. Moving on to the video game side, what do we see? Well, Doom is a benchmark title in more ways than one, so let's whack it out here. Looking at the PS4 using the DS4 pad, the new one, all the tests here are using this pad from here on in. We see a mean or average in both wired and wireless mode of 104 milliseconds. The highs and the lows are all within 4 milliseconds and backs up the game's fast and smooth responsive controls. Remember, this is a variation of different movements and actions. Onto the Xbox One S then. Here all tests now will concentrate on wireless because that's how most people play, but you can see the full test and more information on the website article. Well, it zips in with an average of 154 milliseconds, exactly 50 milliseconds slower than the PS4. Not something anyone really picked up on, but I'll touch on that towards the end of the video. Again, this is an average of actions and different movement in the same room, so this isn't caused by frame rate dips. So moving centuries, galaxies, but into the same high quality 60 frames per second multi-platform title in Battlefield 1. What do we see across the 3 tested versions? Now, I specifically got the Pro in this here for a very specific reason. And that is to quantify and triple check the results, and they land as follows. The base PS4 comes in with an average of 79.6 milliseconds, that's the average on Bluetooth, and the Pro is slightly better, coming in with an average of 75.5. Again, using the Wi-Fi connection or the Bluetooth connection. And the Xbox One comes in at 125 milliseconds, which is obviously slower than the other two machines. So why is this? Well, there's some information here, the fact that this is one of the first titles that actually benefits from using the USB on all three pieces of hardware. I tested, it's very minor, and the Xbox One S also improves. It actually drops down to 112 milliseconds using the USB connection on this title. Now, what is the reason behind this? Well, I believe, and it's obvious, that we are seeing differences here from the operating system, the hardware, and the functionality that the teams use to code on the particular machine in question. Here we are seeing an advantage on the PS4 of nearly twice the amount of what we see on the Xbox One S. Even if the Xbox One S performs better in multiplayer, I believe this is down to how they're rendering the game and the delay, and probably even the fact that they're rendering out at triple buffered rather than double buffered on the title. Again, this is all guesswork. I don't have access to the information and the code base, so I couldn't specifically say. But what we can say is the benefit we're getting from the performance increase here seems to come at the cost of input latency, which 9 times out of 10 is usually coming from the fact that you're buffering your frames slightly longer to smooth out a more consistent frame rate, and that's exactly what we see in the multiplayer sections in the Xbox One S's favour. Now, this also plays out in the single player aspect of the title. But not every game is 60Hz, so what about 30Hz title as well? If we jump into one such as The Division, then we see some of the biggest lag we've seen thus far. 183 milliseconds versus 221 on the Xbox One S. Approximately 35 milliseconds between the two. And this carries over from the lows to the highs, and this isn't a very responsive title. It also brings to the point that third-person titles can actually get away with having a higher input latency than first-person titles, and this generally happens across the board. Not all, mind, it's why first-person shooters tend to be the one that people feel it the most, and 30Hz titles certainly show the difference, and they're both locked at that here. But that's not true of every platform we can look at. But looking at this from the other end of the spectrum, does the PC really offer up much better connectivity? Well, let's test that. If we jump into the operating system and calibrate a controller from the Windows 10 operating system to test the controller ports, we can see a wired DS3 pad plugged in. We get a high of 88 milliseconds and a low of 50 depending on the action, and an average of 67. Obviously, this is using standard polling rates, which you can tweak with some certain features on certain operating systems, along with increasing the polling rate of the mouse. That is entirely up to you. So moving on to the Xbox One controller, the brand new one on the S, plugging that in using the cable, we see very similar performance but a slightly lower, i.e. faster, lowest point on here, and that is 46 milliseconds, 46.4 to be precise, which is a welcome improvement, even if it falls within 4 milliseconds, so therefore within margin of error. So moving into the game and using this very same wired controller, what do we see? A high of 129, a low of 100, and an average of 117 milliseconds. Bearing in mind, this is now 60Hz title, so you are seeing some of the improvement come from the faster response on screen, but that is considerably faster than what we've seen on both consoles. Bearing in mind the averages is kicking around 70 milliseconds faster than this particular sample here, and the Xbox One is slightly higher still. So moving into wireless keyboard and mouse, I know, shock horror, wireless keyboard and mouse, but for me it works on this particular machine. My other machine is wired, but this one is on the wall, TV mounted, and the desktop is next to me and the cabinet, so it all makes sense that I don't have any wires trailing anywhere. Using this on the Division, we see an average of 88 milliseconds. So that's an improvement over the standard controller response and obviously the console releases. We've covered Doom already on the consoles, but what about the PC? Unlike the last title, this one shares the same 60Hz rate on both PC and console alike, so the gap should be smaller, and it is. This time in the favour of the USB powered controller though. 88 average on the mouse and 83 on the controller. again within margin of error, so it could shift ever so slightly, but again the PC wins out and it has a faster response than surprisingly over the console releases. So what about exclusives then? The Xbox One clearly is behind the curve here on both the PS4 and the PC connection, and the PC is ahead of them both. So looking at some exclusives, Halo 5 is a perfect one. It's a lot 60Hz title and therefore should give us the best results for input latency. And by and large it does that. 108 milliseconds as its low point, 142 as a high, and an average of 125 milliseconds. So not the very best here, but very close.
The world was on fire and no one could save me but you.
Well, is that true? Moving into Forza Horizon 3, we see worse figures due to the fact that it's half the frame rate and it obviously has a slower polling system. We see 171 milliseconds as an average and a low of 167. So I would say that's borderline where you'd want it to be. It's not great, but it's not terrible. If it was 60Hz, it would probably be in the region of around 100 milliseconds. So from these tests, the Xbox One does come out worse than the PS4, and I do believe, and bearing in mind there's nothing categorical on this, I do believe the biggest issue here is the operating system and software side is affecting the results that we see here. What do I mean by that? Well, essentially the developers are having to work around software and hardware issues within the Xbox One system, and I believe that the latency issues do come from that and the API level and what is basically available between the Xbox One and the PS4. I don't fundamentally believe that the hardware is the thing to blame here, certainly not at this level of hardware latency, something borne out when you move into some older generation tests which I'll touch on in a second. But certainly the connection between the Bluetooth, the Wi-Fi may be having a very small issue, but ultimately my final verdict is this is a software issue, not a hardware one. There's many things I've said over and over again, and this is certainly borne out by the tests I've seen here and hopefully demonstrated to you guys and girls on screen, and also, like I say, more information on the website. But I do stress this is just my opinion based on my knowledge of hardware coding, software, operating systems and all these kind of things. Nothing here is categoric, but the proof is in the pudding, or at least in the test thus far. But to put this all into some perspective, let's move back to some older generation hardware, back to the Snes and the Megadrive. Yes, 16-bit CRT analog signals, it's where the world started in video games, and we see the fastest response we'll see thus far. Now, this should be no shock to anyone who's played games for longer than the past 10 years. So jumping into a 3D title on the Snes with its Super FX powered Star Fox or Star Wing, we see a latency which isn't really that far away from what we've seen in current games. 117 milliseconds at its average, 108 at its low, and around 121 at its highest point. Now this is a shock. I mean, retro games are meant to be fast, aren't they? And going on these results, you'd have to say that the hardware just isn't up to the task for fast response rate. And obviously that isn't right at all, I'm being facetious. At the end of the day, this is all about the software and the hardware combined to make it work well. Do we get different results if we pop out the cartridge and put something that's more in line with what the machine was designed for, hardware-based sprite pushing power? So exchanging plasma balls for plumber's overalls, we get a completely different response. We now drop down to 50 milliseconds as an average and 46 as a low. That's over half the input latency here, and this is on a CRT machine and is much better than anything else we've tested up until this point. And we use the Megadrive as another example in Golden Axe 3. We get the same figures, 46 milliseconds as a low and 50 milliseconds as an average. So you can see that these are incredibly quick and why CRT still generally wins out. Now this is taking into account the CRT screen, so this is actually how you get it on screen. The other figures are actually even longer than what you're seeing because the input latency to the screen as well, which will obviously vary between set to set and TV to TV, and also how you configure your TV, which you may have seen my how to set up your TV for games video, which explains this in more detail and how you can improve your latency response. So moving on from there, what else are we looking at other than our love for CRT? Well, this proves that response rate does make a difference, but do modern games feel less responsive than these older games? Well, of course not. But like many things, it's the combination and sum of the parts, not the one thing on its own. And here what I'm trying to demonstrate is the fact that variation between latency can be absolutely massive, and yet people don't really notice this at all. So, one of the recent games that's come out, Prey. Now, this has had some information and people have been asking me on the comment section below, and I know that forum sections have been going mad. And what tends to happen with these things is it kind of becomes its own meme. You see it on the internet, you see it on forums, and then they start reporting on it and channels report on it, and then it comes back to itself. And it's kind of crazy. So obviously I tested this, and I tested the Xbox One S and the PS4 to give a view on this particular game. Now the issues here are, the game does have high input latency on both machines. Like I said at the review, it's basically the same as Dishonored 2, it's very high. And at that point I guessed around 150 to 180 milliseconds. Well, actually comparing it and checking it now on my latency test, I can see that I was pretty much bang on the money. Well, sort of. First thing is, I made a comment in passing on my unscripted videos, which I do, which I shouldn't have done, which was regarding the input latency within the context of the performance. What I was saying was, the performance in the firefights was worse, thus the input latency in those sections was slightly worse. But it's not all that simple. This game is an odd one, and it has a strange additional input latency that's happening on both machines. Now, this initial point and its highest peak does vary between the two machines. After the UI responds and then the game moves, it actually has an additional lag, and I don't know why. Now, this lag is around 20 to 24 milliseconds on both machines, and it's actually ever so slightly quicker on the PS4 and the Xbox One. The problem is that the input between that and the highest point is bigger on the PS4 than it is on the Xbox One S, varying by 50 mil from 158 to 208 milliseconds, whereas the Xbox One S varies from 146 to 196, neither of them ideal, but not the worst we've seen here. It's not the delta between the two, but the min and the max, and there is another issue that compounds on them both, and that is the dead zone and the movement on the sticks. Now, neither of them are perfect, but the PS4 is ever so slightly worse, and to one side. The right side is instant. As soon as it moves from the dead zone, pretty much it picks up your movement. But to the left, it's actually got about 3 to 4 times a bigger window of dead zone on both machines. And looking at it, the PS4 is ever so slightly bigger. Now, to quantify this, I went straight into the operating system, picked up the dead zones, and moved both sticks. First ruling out whether or not I've got a sticky stick, basically, or a broken controller, and that's not the case. It picks up the movement instantly from the main center, and you get movement as soon as you move the sticks, based on how fast you move them and the input pole into the system. Again, back to the software side I spoke about earlier. It's all about the software. You can set how much you want to actually pick up that movement, i.e. small subtle movements. If you had it running like that in a game where the smallest movement created movement on screen, everyone would go mad, because people's fingers, even if you can't feel it, you don't rest at ease. They'll move ever so slightly. It would cause the control to judder. So how games control that is they push that movement zone, that dead zone, wider on the sticks. So as you push the stick left, right, up or down, you get a subtle 1 to 2 millisecond movement on the sticks before it responds and then starts accelerating your movement through. What we're seeing here is both sticks have a problem to the left more than the right, but the PS4 seems to have it slightly more, i.e. maybe another 2 to 3 milliseconds. Not massive, but certainly not identical. Now, in and of itself, this is not bad. You can try this yourself. Go into the menu system, both the Xbox One or the PS4, and get the left analog stick and just push it ever so slightly and watch the screen move. You'll see how far the sticks move from the center point before it picks up movement. Just hold it there. You'll see it won't move for at least 2 or 3 mil. Now, this is the movement that the operating system and all the software is designed to ignore, to stop it being overly responsive and therefore annoying people in use. And video games certainly fall into that category. So we are seeing that here in Prey, just like we saw, shockingly enough, with Rise of the Tomb Raider, another game that got a lot of stick for the PS4 having terrible latency. And in actual fact, it was because they're very close indeed between the two. Now, the average stick movement on the Xbox One seems to be ever so slightly smaller, the dead zone is smaller, than the PS4. So that, combined with the movement and the software set, the dead zone, is the reason why we're seeing this here. You can also go into the menu system, the control system. I don't play at default settings. I usually ramp up the movement, the acceleration, very similar to mouse acceleration, and bump it up higher on the sticks. And you'll see that it feels a little quicker and more responsive. Now, effectively, the team have come out and said that they're going to fix this latency. Now, the long-winded response that they've given you is the fact that all they're really saying is they're going to alter this dead zone that I've just spoke about. This is the point that they changed. They're going to move this down to have a smaller circle of dead zone, so the acceleration is slightly quicker on the lower end of the scale. Effectively, they're shortening the tail of the movement. So you'll see that the gradual shift between 20 will probably more like it is now at 80, and this will reduce the input latency lag. Now, is there anything else they can do with the engine? Well, of course they can. We've seen with various examples here and with Rise of the Tomb Raider in public patches that you can play around with the latency in a game by changing lots and lots of features. And there's too much here. I'm not going to know or even second guess what the team are going to achieve with the CryEngine tweaks here. But unfortunately, all we can say is the input latency on this game is there or thereabouts, the same as Dishonored 2. It's pretty high. That said, they do need to fix this additional input lag that's in there on both machines. But the difference here is much smaller than what we've seen on all of the titles I've just covered. And much of this is the fact that the input latency, if you've got both machines, you're used to this, even though you're not consciously aware. You're used to the PS4 being around 30 to 50 milliseconds quicker than the Xbox One S, and you're not seeing it here. And we saw a very similar trend in Rise of the Tomb Raider, which had the same kind of uproar. Please don't take my word for it, get the sticks, have a try yourself. You'll see the amount of movement you need within the sticks to get this game to work. And this is effectively what they're going to release with the patch today, basically, on the console release. I have the PC version, and we'll be looking at that tomorrow, and we'll be covering the input latency, frame rate, and performance. So please check back soon. If all of it went over your head or it found a bit bamboozled, then please jump online, read more of the detail in the written article on site. There's more graphs, there's more information, and more of a description of how this all works. I'll endeavour to have it on the site as soon as possible. And if you enjoyed this or anything else that I've put together, please like and subscribe and share where appropriate. Leave all your thoughts and feedback below. I'll reply as often as possible, and I'll catch you on the next one.